She was mid-sentence when my phone rang. 40 people at that table. Neighbors, contractors, guys who'd driven 90 minutes to be there, people who'd known us for decades. And Diane was still talking, still building her case, when I reached into my jacket, looked at the screen, and put the call on speaker. The room went silent before she could finish her sentence. That moment is where this story ends. But to understand what happened when that voice came through the speaker, you need to know what the 8 months before it looked like. My name is Ray Callahan, 58 years old. Callahan Commercial Contracting, South Boulevard, Charlotte. Same office since 1994. Commercial builds, warehouse retrofits, industrial contracts across both Carolinas. 30 years of 5:45 a.m. site walks and deals held together entirely by reputation. This past year, we crossed $2 million in annual revenue for the first time. None of it flashy, none of it news, but every dollar earned before most people were awake. Diane hadn't asked about the business in years. That February, she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter. She was in the shower. I wasn't looking for anything. I was reaching past it for my keys, but a name on that screen stopped me cold. A name connected to money I didn't even know was being moved. I stood there long enough to know something was very wrong, then picked up my keys and drove to work without saying a word. That afternoon, I called Frank Malone, the only attorney I'd ever trusted with everything I'd built. I still wonder sometimes how many people have sat at a table just like that one, holding something they can't yet say out loud. Frank spent the next 12 weeks building what came next. It wasn't just one thing. It kept showing up. Same type of move, same kind of timing, going back further than I'd realized. Every time Frank called with something new, I'd sit in my truck in the parking lot and just stare at the steering wheel. 30 years. And I was realizing I might not have known my own house. That's the kind of thing that doesn't hit all at once. It comes in slow, one piece at a time, until the whole picture finally lands and you can't unfocus your eyes from it. There were moments I almost said something to her. Almost. But Frank told me to wait. Said the timing mattered more than the confrontation. He was right. That night, standing at the head of that table, wine glass raised, telling 40 people she was exhausted from carrying me, Diane believed she had already won. She'd done everything she needed to do. Signed what needed signing, moved what needed moving. What she didn't know was that Frank had already filed. And when his name appeared on my screen at 9:06 p.m., I already knew what he was going to say. I just didn't know how bad it was going to be for her. Frank's voice came through that speaker calm and steady, the way a man sounds when he's been waiting a long time to make one phone call. 8 words. Ray, the filing went through. She can't touch it. I set the phone face down on the table, didn't say a word, just looked at Diane. She was still holding her wine glass, and for the first time that evening, she wasn't talking. To understand what Frank had just stopped, I need to go back to that February night. The name on Diane's laptop was Dennis Hartwell, a financial consultant I'd met once at a chamber event on South Boulevard. Diane had introduced him herself, said he was helping her organize some personal accounts after her mother passed. I believed her. I had no reason not to. What Frank found was something else entirely. Dennis hadn't been working on personal accounts. He'd been working on ours. Joint savings. A secondary business account I hadn't accessed in months because the primary was running clean. And a transfer, $94,000, moved quietly into an LLC I had never heard of, never signed for. Registered address? A mailbox on Wilkinson Boulevard. $94,000. Gone before I'd even thought to look. When Frank told me that number, I sat in my truck outside his office on a Tuesday afternoon and didn't move for 20 minutes. 30 years of early mornings. 30 years of keeping every promise on a handshake. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, while I was working, she was moving pieces I didn't know were on the board. I still don't know what number I'd put on a moment like that. That wasn't the worst part. Frank traced the LLC back through 2 layers of Mecklenburg County filings. The second layer had a co-signatory, Not Dennis Hartwell, someone else. Someone who had sat at our dinner table more times than I could count. Someone I had trusted almost as long as I'd trusted Diane. Maybe longer in some ways. I didn't react. Didn't give Frank the satisfaction of hearing it land. But I felt it. The way you feel something when the ground underneath a life you built turns out to be thinner than you ever imagined. Frank asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him I needed one more thing before we moved. One conversation, face to face, before there was no coming back from it. The conversation happened 3 days before the dinner. I asked Diane to sit down at the kitchen table. Same table we'd eaten breakfast at for 22 years. And I put one question in front of her. Not an accusation, not a confrontation, just a question, worded carefully enough that she'd have no reason to think I already knew the answer. I asked her if there was anything about our finances she wanted to tell me. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled, that same warm smile from the dinner, and said everything was fine. Said she'd actually been thinking about our retirement timeline. Said maybe it was time we sat down with someone and made a real plan. I nodded. Said that sounded like a good idea. She believed that conversation went her way. I needed her to. What I hadn't told Frank yet, what I hadn't told anyone, was the second name. The co-signatory on that LLC, Gary Phelps. 26 years. Gary had been my site foreman since we were both young enough to pour concrete ourselves. I'd lent him money twice, once when his daughter needed surgery, once when his mortgage went underwater in 2009. Never asked for either back, never needed to. His name on that document didn't just hurt, it rearranged things. The way a betrayal does when it doesn't come from one direction, it comes from every direction at once. And the picture you had of your own life turns out to be something someone else had been quietly building around you. I sat with that for 2 days before I called Frank back. When I told him Gary's name, Frank went quiet. Then he said, "Ray, this changes everything. She didn't do this alone, and she didn't do it by accident. Planned. Not a mistake, not a moment. Planned." That word sat in my chest the whole drive home. The night of the dinner, I got dressed, drove to the venue, found my seat, and watched Diane work the room for 45 minutes. Warm, gracious. The kind of wife people look at and think, that man is lucky. I watched Gary Phelps take his seat 12 feet away and laugh at someone's joke. Neither of them knew what Frank had filed. Neither of them knew what was already locked. And neither of them knew the phone in my jacket had one number ready, and that I was simply waiting for Diane to give me exactly the moment I needed. She chose it herself. When Diane finished her toast, the room wasn't applauding. 40 people had just heard a wife stand up and dismantle her husband of 30 years. Some had their drinks halfway raised. Some had set them back down. That uncertainty sat over the room like a ceiling that had dropped 6 inches. I let it sit. Then I picked up my phone and answered it. Frank didn't waste words. "It's done, Ray. She can't touch any of it." I said, "Thank you, Frank." Put the phone back in my jacket. Didn't stand up, didn't look around the room, just sat there, the same way I'd been sitting for 40 minutes while Diane performed. But the table had heard enough. Ed Carver, 20 years in commercial real estate, sharp as anyone I've worked with, leaned over slowly and said, "Ray, was that your attorney?" It was. He nodded once, set his glass down, and looked at Diane. That's when it moved through the room. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way bad news travels when people are too polite to react openly. In glances, in the sudden stillness of a hand reaching for a fork. In conversations that stopped mid-sentence and didn't restart. Diane felt it before she understood it. I watched her scan the room. The same practiced scan she used at every social event to measure how she was landing. And I watched it falter. The smile held, but her eyes went careful in a way they hadn't been 60 seconds ago. She looked at me. I looked back, said nothing. Then she looked at Gary. Gary Phelps had gone completely still. drink in his hand, not moving, not talking, staring at the table like a man doing arithmetic he already knows the answer to. Diane looked back at me one more time. I could see it, the exact second she understood that what she'd spent 8 months building had already been taken apart. Quietly, legally, completely. Before she ever stood up to give that toast. She opened her mouth slightly. Nothing came out. I said the only thing I had left to say to her. It didn't have to end like this. Diane didn't sleep in the house that night. I don't know where she went. I didn't ask. By the time the dinner ended and the last guest had made their way out, slower than usual, quieter than usual, she'd gathered her coat and left without looking at me again. Gary left 6 minutes before she did, same exit, didn't say goodbye to anyone. I stayed until the end, finished my coffee, thanked the staff, drove home on South Boulevard the same way I'd driven it 1,000 times. Past the office, past the Truist branch where our joint account had sat untouched for 8 months. Past the city I'd built a business in for 30 years. Quiet drive. I didn't mind it. Frank filed an asset protection order with Mecklenburg County, the same Wednesday I'd told Diane I was at a job site in Columbia. It froze every account connected to our joint holdings the moment it was recorded. The LLC on Wilkinson Boulevard was flagged simultaneously. The $94,000 moved 14 months ago was now under civil recovery, a filing Frank's office had been building since March. Dennis Hartwell's attorney called Frank the following Monday. Gary Phelps resigned by email. No phone call, no explanation. 17 lines. I read it once and deleted it. 26 years, 17 lines. Some things you don't have words for. You just keep moving. The divorce took 14 months. Diane's attorney was good. Frank was better. The paper trail Dennis and Gary left across 2 years of quiet transfers turned out to be the kind of evidence that makes attorneys on the other side go very still in a conference room. Civil recovery settled for $91,000. Frank told me $3,000 short was standard. I told him I didn't care about the $3,000. I cared about the record. The record mattered, because 30 years from now, if anyone looks, it will show exactly what happened, who did what, and how it ended. People ask if I regret not confronting her sooner, not walking away from that dinner before she ever got to her feet. I don't. What I learned in those 8 months, about patience, about evidence, about knowing the difference between what feels right and what actually works, that's worth more than any confrontation ever would have been. Diane wanted 40 witnesses to watch me lose. She got 40 witnesses, just not to what she planned. I built this business on one principle. You don't make your move until the ground is solid. The ground was solid. It had been for months. I just waited. Until she finished talking.